Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Native American Studies Center at USC Lancaster. I'm your host, Chris Judge. Before I introduce our speaker for today, got a couple announcements for you. First, on October 15th, our next Lunch and Learn lecture will be with Brandon Jones. Brandon Jones is the Catawba River Keeper, and he will be giving us an update on the state of the Catawba River. These are folks that do ecotourism things. They look for point source pollution and try to keep the river clean for all of us. And so Brandon will be giving us a great update on what the Catawba River Foundation is up to. Let's see, since we last met, Brent Bergen has retired. Brent retired on August 31st. And obviously this lecture series is named for him. And a new fund has been established to name the archives after Brent. And that is just getting underway, and you'll be hearing more about that. Looking forward to that. I forgot to mention some exciting news. Brandon Jones will be giving his lecture in person, and we were also going to continue to stream our lectures to all of y'all that are at a distance. I see Paul and Anita Campbell are sitting in the room today, and they're from Michigan. And so it's great to reach out and see our friends from both near and far. Today, we are excited to have our friend Mary Beth Fitz here. I think she's lectured several times on our campus. I know she was here for a Native American Studies Week one time. And if I'm not mistaken, we had a Catawba Watery River Archaeology Conference, and she lectured in that one too. So some of you are probably gonna recognize her. She is an assistant state archaeologist in the Office of State Archaeology up in North Carolina. She does everything from outreach to environmental review, works with the State Historic Preservation Office on nominations for the National Register. And she's also apparently a member of the scientific diving team up there, like our friend Dave Cranford, who was speaking with us at the beginning of this summer. Mary Beth has her PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She looked at the ethnohistory of the Catawba, examining foodways and the coalescence that was going on there in the mid-18th century, part of what she'll be talking about today. She was a lab supervisor and a research assistant in the research labs while a student, and I think for a little while afterward. And she's also worked in the Forest Service down in Florida on the Apalachicola National Forest and with the Florida Division of Historical Resources down in Tallahassee. Today, she's going to be talking about one of the towns that coalesced here in the mid-18th century, and talking about the archaeology of Charraw or Charraw or Sarah. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but I think that Mary Beth will get us going in here in a minute. So that's it for me. I give you Mary Beth Fitz. So all over to you, Mary Beth.
Together and then doing Lexington and Orangeburg separate, because that just kind of makes sense.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Chris, for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Okay, so yeah, hi, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Chris, and thanks to everyone at the Native American Studies Center for this wonderful lecture series and for having me today. And of course, thanks to everyone who's listening now and in the future. If you're listening to this in the future, hi from the past. So I'd like to start out with an acknowledgement. I'm located in Raleigh right now, and I'm speaking to you from there. And this is a picture of not Raleigh, but Raven Rock State Park. It's one of North Carolina's state parks, but it kind of gives a good picture, I think, that's representative of the North Carolina Piedmont. And where I'm speaking from is the ancestral land of many Indian tribes, indigenous people that historically would have been identified as Siouan, Iroquoian, or Algonquin. Over the past 14,000 or more years, essentially time immemorial, this land sustained family life, provided nourishment, served as a safe and secure environment for the development of rich cultural traditions. Throughout colonial history, Native American communities across North Carolina have demonstrated resilience and resistance in the face of sustained traumatic and violent efforts to separate them from their culture and land. Today, the state of North Carolina recognizes the Catawba, Cherokee, Cohari, Kiowa, Saponi, Lumbee, Meherrin, Occaneechi, Saponi, and Waccamaw American Indian tribes as the descendants of many historic and distinct tribes that lived across what is now North Carolina before European settlement. American Indians today live in all 100 counties and major urban areas across the state. And for more information, about Indians in North Carolina, please also contact the North Carolina Commission of Indian Affairs. They've got a really useful website. And I want to thank Danny Bell for some of those words. So moving forward to today's topic, basically my goal is to try to answer 3 questions. So, and those are, who are the Charraw and how did some of them become part of the Catawba Nation? What evidence exists that an archaeological site near Fort Mill, South Carolina, is the remains of a place known as Charraw Town? What was found during archaeological work at Charraw Town, and how can it inform our understanding of Catawba history, and of course, Charraw history as well? So I want to first start out by emphasizing this idea of the Charraw are really kind of a refugee community that were found a way to survive colonialism by moving across the landscape. And they were not alone in this. They were just happened to be one of the better documented communities. And they really, in this sense, serve kind of as an example of what a lot of Native people experienced during the colonial period. So in learning about Charraw history, we learn about what life was like for many indigenous groups during the early colonial period, when there was increased violence and uncertainty, and sometimes they were forced to make difficult decisions. So yeah, we'll be talking about that more. So starting out on the Dan River, this is the Fry and Jefferson map. Obviously, it's actually pretty late for what we'll be talking about. It's 751, and was made after the Charraw were no longer on the Dan River. These are actually the areas that have circled that say Upper Saratown and Lower Saratown are actually European American settlements at that point in time. Upper Saratown actually had a post office until 1882. But what the reason I'm showing this map is because it is a good example of something we know that's very common all across the Americas, really. But of course, where you live, I'm sure it's somewhere where there's the name of an indigenous community that gets reused by the European colonists who come after them. So the earliest, the earliest written reference to Charraw on the Dan River is that we have is from 1674. Abraham Wood of Virginia wrote about the adventures or misadventures of James Needham and Gabriel Arthur, who were 2 traders. And they traded with Indian communities along the Virginia-North Carolina line, including the Charraw. And actually, in Wood, in his account, calls the Dan River the Charraw River. Archaeological work on the Dan River suggests that the Sarah had lived there for a long time. The remains of villages associated with their ancestors are known as the Dan River phase. And after 1600 AD, archaeological sites formerly home to indigenous communities living on the Dan River are attributed to the Saratown phase. These Sarah communities were Siouan speaking and are thought to be responsible for one of the dialects of the Catawba Nation. The William Klitz site is the last known Saratown village on the Dan River archaeologically. It dates to the late Saratown period between 1670 and 1710. And behind those trees in this picture is the Dan River. So you can see that this is in a bottomland field. And at this time, the Charraw were primarily farmers. although we know they supplemented their diets with a variety of wild foods. In addition to trade goods, archaeologists from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, who worked at the site, found a diverse range of pottery, which seemed to suggest that people from around the area had been gathering there. And this is something this will be kind of a theme throughout this talk, is this idea of people gathering together for safety during the colonial period. That was a strategy that really served folks well during this time. William Byrd, who was part of the group that surveyed the North Carolina-Virginia state line in 1728, blamed the frequent inroads of the Seneca for the Sarah decision to evacuate their homes and move south to settle on the PD River. But this decision was also likely informed by a widespread smallpox epidemic that raged across the Southeast in the very late 1600s, in the closing years, really, of the 1600s, which was caused in large part by human trafficking associated with Indian slave trade. So it's possible that people were gathering at this site, at the Klitz site, as a way for protection, so they could better defend themselves. But then also, because of that, living close together may have suffered from that smallpox epidemic. We know that the Charraw were on the PD River in 1711 because that's where Captain John Barnwell found them on his way to attack the Tuscarora Indians in North Carolina during that year. And this map on the left is technically anonymous, but it was clearly produced with information from Barnwell. And I wanted to show it in combination with the 1733 Moseley map, also of the same stretch of the PD River, because it shows 3 towns. The Kiowa, which in this first map are up here in a branch of the Yadkin, the Charraw or the Sarahs on the PD, and then the PD, of course, themselves on the PD. So in the first map, they're all separate. In the second map, you can see the Kiowa have moved and are now living with the Charraw on the PD River. So again, the same strategy that folks were following, up on the Dan River to combine together to form, for defense, to form larger villages, seems to also be happening in this situation as well. The Charraw are building a confederation on the PD River. So one thing I'd like to, at this kind of juncture, this move where we're trying to documenting the Charraw movement from the Dan River to the PD, from what is now North Carolina to South Carolina. There's a change in how the name is spelled, and I think that's often confused a lot of people. And I have an argument, it may not be exactly right, but I think it sort of is a good explanation for why that spelling changes. It has to do actually with just one man. His name was Thomas Lambeau. He was born in Charlestown in 1694. And so he was 10 to 11 years old during the Yamasee War. Lambeau attended school and then apprenticed with a local merchant, which was critical experience for him being hired as a clerk and bookkeeper for South Carolina's Board of Indian Trade in 1716, when he was 22. This was just the start of Lambeau's career. He served as a government official in several capacities over the next 50 years and was finally a judge. And he's buried in the circular church graveyard in Charleston. It's his headstone on the left. So on the right, you can see a sample of his handwriting from the Board of Indian Trade records. It seems Lambeau was most often taking notes from oral testimony, and he spelled the names differently depending on how he heard them. Growing up around English speakers, French-speaking Huguenots, and Native people, Lambeau likely had a keen ear. So when he heard the name Charraw, he decided to spell it with a CH rather than an S, which I think he intended to sound like CH in chef. It's close to, but not the same as the S sound in English. So we end up with a situation where all the English records prior to Lambeau, that were mostly produced by Virginians, are spelling Charraw with an S, but afterwards the CH spelling gains traction, particularly in South Carolina. This is a copy of a Deerskin Map made in 1721 by a Catawba leader, and it shows the Charraw as an element of the Confederacy that included most of the indigenous groups in the Piedmont of South Carolina. That these diplomatic relationships indicated by this map weren't always rosy can be seen by the situation that happened during the MSC War, where the Charraw provided refuge to Waxhaw who were fleeing a Catawba attack. But more often than not, the Charraw and Catawba appear to have been cooperating allies. When the Charraw and PD sold 40 fields to a man named John Thompson in 1737, a large number of Charraw moved to the Catawba Nation, founding Charrawtown. And predictably, the same thing that happened on the PD River happened on the Dan River, in that the Charraws came to be a place that was where Europeans were actually living. They kept the name. In the 1760s, the South Carolina Gazette contains reference to places called the Great Charraws and the Little Charraws. And by 1764, you could subscribe to the newspaper at the Charraws. By 1770, which is this advertisement in the newspaper here, settlers at the Charraws had organized and received approval to hire someone to build them a courthouse and a jail. So the arrival of a large number of Charraw people in the Catawba Nation coincides with the period of Catawba history that's been called the Coalescent Period, which lasts from about the end of the MSC War in 1715 to 1759, when the nation was struck by a smallpox epidemic that caused drastic loss of life and changes in how people lived, much like today. I just mentioned the earlier Confederation period represented by a Deerskin Map, when towns worked together. They were distant, but they worked together politically, and they presented a united front to European colonists. During the Coalescent period, Charraw, PD, and other Indian people from across the Carolinas moved to the area around Nation Ford, where a major trading path crossed the Catawba River. Most of these refugees seem to have joined existing Catawba communities. As far as we can tell from the archival records, the Charraw were one of maybe only two groups that started their own independent town. They were the only ones that had an independent town. The other group, the YFP, were allied with another town. So from living and working close together, people formed a culturally and politically Catawba Nation at Nation Ford. Those communities were evacuated during a smallpox epidemic in 1759, and when people returned, kind of jumped the gun there a little bit. When people returned after the smallpox epidemic of 59, they settled in the vicinity of 12 Mile Creek, and my colleague David Cranford has argued that Ayerstown, one of these places, the only place or community at this time on the west side of the river, was the new Charrawtown, basically. During this period, the Catawba households worked to participate in the developing colonial economy, whether that was by making pottery to sell to colonists, by farming, or by leasing land. At Ayerstown, there's evidence that the Charraw continued to farm and were also experimenting with the pottery trade. That's a little background on who the Charraw are and how many ended up living with the Catawba. The next question I want to address is, what evidence exists that an archaeological site near Fort Mill, South Carolina, is the remains of Charrawtown, specifically the Charrawtown shown on this map, which was made in 1756 by John Evans, who served as what we today would call an ambassador, really, for the British colony of South Carolina to the Catawba Nation. Evans mapped 6 Catawba towns within an area of about 3 square miles and determined that together these towns could raise about 204 warriors. He also mapped the trading paths, which are the little dots on the map, as well as 5 unnamed tributaries of the Catawba. And critically, the ford, which you can see at the very bottom of the map, crossing the Catawba. And looking based on the compass rose, which is cut off the part of the map you're seeing here, we can tell that this part of the river is running east-west. So that's another critical piece of information. There's only one easily forded section of the Catawba River in this section of the lower Catawba, and that's on the 1825 Mills Atlas is called Old Nation Ford. So while planning a research project about the 18th century Catawba Nation in the Aughties, Steve Davis and Brett Riggs at UNC's Chapel Hill's Research Labs of Archaeology noted this alignment of Evans' map, with Nation Ford and with the modern landscape, knowing where that ford is, and proposed that several previously recorded archaeological sites could be the remains of towns that Evans visited. One of these was Charraw Town. Another, located to the west, is the twin town of Nassau-Wayape. My focus today is on Charraw Town, but it's important to know that Nassau-Wayape was home to a community whose ancestors had lived in the Catawba Valley. So in the final portion of my talk, I'll be comparing Charraw Town archaeology with Nassau-Wayape archaeology. And in doing that, what I'm kind of doing is comparing what the locals had been doing with what the newcomer refugee community was doing as they adjusted to living, in this new place at Nation Ford. So based on Evans' map, there's a specific place, a specific archaeological site we identified that could be Charraw Town. So what evidence might make it more likely that this place actually was Charraw Town? Obviously, we're never going to find a rock sitting there that's inscribed, this was Charraw Town. However, we can look at the artifacts that were found there and see if they date to the same time period as Evans' map. One of the more useful types of artifacts to do this is pipe stems, and that's because the style and manufacturing process of these pipes changed over time. Specifically, in one regard, the size of the hole in the pipe stem actually got smaller. So this means that when you have a number of pipe stem fragments, you can measure the size of those holes and get a general sense of when people were living there, smoking pipes. At Charraw Town, the distribution of the pipe stems most closely matches the 1750 to 1800 time period and trends really more towards the earlier side of this range, which makes it consistent with the time frame of Evans' map. And I say that it trends to the earlier end of the range because you can see that someone sat down and measured a lot of pipe stems, and these are the kind of the results they came up with in terms of percentages. So the 77, 83, those are percentages. So when we look at the pipe stems from Charraw Town, of which there are 459, the pipe stems with 4 64th inch bores account for only really 59% as opposed to 77. So that we're kind of skewed more towards the 1750 end of the time frame. So we know the site dates to the mid 1700s, okay, but who lived there? To confirm that this was Charraw Town and not an early settler home site in the same time period, we can look at artifacts that would have been made or used by Southeastern American Indians during the same time. One of these types of artifacts is beads. Native sites from this period have hundreds of seed beads all over the place because they were a key element of dress and regalia. This was not the case with Euro-Americans. So it turns out hundreds of beads like these have been recovered from the Charraw Town site. In addition, the presence of American Indian pottery at Charraw Town is strong evidence for the presence of Native people living there. Fragments of bowls and jars recovered from Charraw Town were not Catawba trade pottery. They were cooking and serving vessels consistent with those made by Carolina Piedmont Indians for their own use. These are some examples of those from Charraw Town. So based on the 1756 map and how it aligns with the modern landscape, using Nation Ford as a reference point, the pipe stem date, and the presence of beads and native pottery, it's pretty reasonable to suggest that the archaeological site tentatively identified as being Charraw Town on the Evans map is the real deal. Which leads us to our third question. What was found during archaeological work at Charraw Town, and how can it inform our understanding of Charraw and Catawba history? Rather than keep you in suspense, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you right away that the pottery, beads, plant and animal remains, and waste for metalworking that were found at Charraw Town, and they all seem to suggest that the Charraw kind of kept their individual identity as a distinct people during this time, even though they had moved to the Catawba Nation. However, there's also evidence that Charraw women were working along with Catawba women from other towns during this time. So I'll get into the details of why I think that in a moment, but first it's important to get a sense of what it's like on the ground at Charraw Town. This is an aerial image that shows the landscape and the location of some of the initial survey work that was done there. You can see a house, a pasture, even a dirt racetrack. And if you look even closer, especially towards the bottom part of this map, should have gotten a brighter looking cursor, but if you see movement down there, there's some lines you can kind of see on the ground. I've highlighted those in red. Those seem to be terracing, the remains of terraces from when this whole area was an agricultural field. So given these disturbances, it's actually really kind of amazing that there's any intact soils at the site at all. Charraw Town is a reminder, actually, that intact archaeological sites can exist in places where archaeologists usually write them off as just being too disturbed. This is a photo showing some of that initial survey work. You can see the house through the trees. Initial testing showed that while most of the site did not have topsoil, the back edges of those terraced areas did have the potential to contain intact deposits. So in 2011, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill Research Labs of Archaeology held a field school there. And to better assess the condition of the site and to see what actually was intact. And this is an aerial image showing the extent of the site and where those field school excavations were. During the field school, we didn't test in the northern portion of the site because that was being actively used as a hayfield. We did test in the cow pasture on the southern portion, the very kind of southern edge there. So we had one excavation block on the eastern side of the site and then a couple others on the western side of the site. And overall, 112 square meters of the site were tested and excavated. The eastern part of the site, we found evidence of a house, which was surprising and exciting, really. We found post holes, small pit features, which are underground storage features, and also feature 2, which is yellow in this map, which it was a trash-filled gully. It looks kind of like this linear amorphous blob there. It might have been a kind of a drip line from the house, potentially from the eave of the roof, something to that extent. And this picture on the right shows that gully being excavated. In the, sorry, this is a picture of one of those underground storage features I was talking about. So people used them sort of as mini cellars, really. And then when things rotted in there or the pits were no longer needed, these holes were filled in with soil from around the house, and sometimes trash. So in that sense, they're kind of like time capsules of what was laying around the place when the hole got filled in. And since they're below grade, they can escape disturbance from plowing, which is why they often contain some of the most intact archaeological materials. So this is work taking place at the western part of the site. There is no house found in this location, but the soils were relatively deep. And in addition to being deep, they contained pottery, carbonized plant remains, and beads. So many beads, in fact, that we decided to wash these soils through window screen, in addition to the standard 1/4-inch hardwire mesh. This means that the field school students got to play in the mud a little bit. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the evidence I think that shows the Charraw were in some ways keeping to themselves maintaining their own traditions, but in other ways also participating with the neighboring Catawba communities in the 3-mile area mapped by Evans. First, I'd like to talk about pottery, which we know women played a large part in making at that time. Now, this might seem like this first slide shows something that might seem like kind of a minor thing, but it's really noticeable that the pottery at Charraw was thicker, it had thicker walls than the pottery made by Catawba women at that nearby town of Nassau. I'm not sure why this is, but it probably is related to how they learned to make the walls and shape the vessels of the bowls and jars that they made. In addition, the Charraw women were using different tools to make pottery. We can tell this by looking at the markings on the outside of the pottery. At this time, and for generations prior, Catawba women had used carved wooden paddles that left distinctive curvy lines in the clay. The drawing on the left shows kind of examples of what those tools would have looked like. First, those are actually the designs, are much earlier designs, and they're from Georgia, but this concept is the same. And those designs likely had very important meanings for the potters as well. As far as we can tell, even going back to when they lived on the Dan River, the Charraw did not typically use those types of paddles. That wasn't a part of how they made pottery. So then it's not surprising that when we go to look at the pottery from Charraw Town in the Catawba Nation, they didn't suddenly start making those paddles. They carried on with the way they knew how to make pottery. So there's much fewer complicated stamped sherds in the Charraw Town assemblage when you look at it in comparison to that other Catawba town. And that's what I circled there. Otherwise, you can see that those distributions look similar in what the outside of the pottery looks like, but that's the one difference. Another thing we can look at is the incised decorations on bowls. At this time, there were kind of, roughly speaking, 2 general types of sets of designs. Ones like this, with multiple parallel lines and with periodically little curvy bits, were made by potters on the Catawba River for generations prior. Patterns with hatching marks were more commonly used by Piedmont Siouan potters further north, folks like the Charraw potters. But interestingly, there doesn't seem to be any really clear pattern with regard to these designs in the pottery assemblages from these 2 sites from the 1750s. They both kind of have both of those kinds of designs in the assemblages. This one bowl, this is a fragment of a bowl, it even has both kinds of designs on it, which I find really interesting. It seems to indicate that women were open to experimenting with this kind of decoration. That they weren't in this area. They were, interested in, exploring, or maybe artistically, and doing different things. Now I'm going to shift gears to fashion. How people were really showing their identity through clothing. A variety of beads were found at Charraw Town, and these are just some examples. But the vast, vast majority were black and white beads. The same is true for the Catawba Towns, Nassau Waipi. And actually, if you look at this distribution based on the numbers, well, the first thing you'll see is we're talking about thousands, literally thousands of beads, which is, as you might imagine, took a lot of labor and time to count all those beads. And I have to give a shout out to Elise Duffield-Schumann. There are many students that helped to do this work at UNC Chapel Hill, but Elise's mission was the beads, and she did a lot of great work with the bead analysis. So when we look at the distribution, you can see that for the black beads, 32.4 for Nassau Waipi, 33.1 for Charraw. Same with the white, 67.5, 66.7. It's not even a whole percentage point difference, despite these thousands and thousands of beads, which suggests, and also, another thing to point out is that it's, you can see that it's 2 to 1 black to white. So you can imagine that people were making designs where the white was the background, and then the black was the whatever design they were making was in that field of white beads. And there's also a similar pattern between the two sites, again, when we look at colors, bead colors. However, there's a difference in being that there's more beads with red hues at Charraw Town. And even though it's 5% or so difference, given the number of beads, that is statistically significant. So it seemed that while Charraw were dressing like the Catawba and really all other Southeastern Indians at that time, they were using more red in their designs. And this may have had symbolic importance since they were newcoming junior members of the Catawba Nation at that time. Okay, moving on to food. We know that food is a large part of what people consider tradition. So what were Charraw Town people eating? They were getting a lot of calories from maize and nuts, we know. Both of these have a long history as a staple food in the Southeast. So when we look at the staple foods, maize and nuts, and we're looking at again, Charraw Town, they're on the top in this comparison, compared to the Catawba folks at Nassau. These bow tie things line up exactly, pretty much, which suggests that they're eating maize and nuts in the same amounts, relative to each other, which again speaks to kind of the uniformity of that aspect of the diet. But then when we look at those staple foods relative to fruits, all kinds of fruits, peaches, grapes, blackberries, maypops, strawberry, there's more evidence that Charraw women were collecting fruit and that people were, bringing fruit. The seeds are ending up back in Charraw Town. So that's kind of interesting, and it may be evidence that they maybe had a harder time accessing staple foods, or that they were already living in an area. They were along this main trading path that leads to Nation Ford, and maybe there was more disturbance there from that area being inhabited for such a long period of time. Disturbance areas, like field edges are good growth areas for fruits. So that could be they just had more fruits available to them, or it could be both of those things. Another difference between the Charraw, between the Charraw and elsewhere in the Catawba Nation is that women seem to have been processing less corn in their villages, or at least processing it differently. So what we're looking at in this graph is there's less pieces of maize cob pieces called cupules relative to actual corn kernels. And there's less of those cupules in the Charraw Town botanical assemblages, which is why those bow ties don't line up in this graph. We're not sure exactly what this means, but again, the Charraw were doing something differently. It may be somehow related to the fact that agricultural fields were passed along through female lineages among Southeastern Indians, and that the Charraw, this large group of Charraw people moved at once, and we don't really know how that played into the existing field allocation. Surely that the women had it worked out which fields, which community was getting their food from which fields, and how all that food distribution worked. So this difference could somehow be related to complications in getting that all worked out. The final thing I want to, well, actually not the final, but the other part of the food is animal bones. And I'm really just going to talk about bears and deer, because bone preservation was not great at these sites. But interestingly, there were more black bear remains found at Charraw Town. In addition to meat, bear was prized for its fat, which was processed into oil. Overall, the pattern that you're seeing, and I've kind of colorized the bear, so the dark blue areas are, there's more of those pieces of bone represented in the Charraw town assemblage, and then less in the lighter colored areas, and none if it's white. You can see there's a lot of head bones, which is interesting. I mean, you'd kind of imagine that the bear heads would arrive. But interestingly, there was none, maybe more interestingly, there weren't any head bones at Charraw. And head and toes and feet are some of the most durable parts of the skeleton, which is why, really why there's more of them in these assemblages. And interesting, you can see that same pattern with the deer, where there's more toes and feet parts in the assemblages. But in this case, it's the opposite from the bear, in that there's almost no head elements of deer in the Charraw town assemblage. Whereas at Nassau, you can see there are 122, deer skull fragments. So this is interesting in part because we know deer brains were an important component of the hide processing, curing process. So were the Charraw processing deer hides outside the village? Were they doing it in a place that we didn't examine during the field school in 2011? Or not processing them at all for some reason? Any of those could be possible, I guess. That's kind of up in the air. And then finally, for something completely different, it was common during the 1700s for Southeastern Indians to use copper trade kettles as raw material to make other items, like tinkling cones and spearheads like you see here, or arrowheads. So at all the Catawba towns were, folks were doing this, but there's a higher percentage of manufacturing waste, 70% in the Charraw town assemblage. This might mean Charraw households were producing items not just for themselves, but maybe to trade. Is this how they worked as refugees, maybe to overcome not having inherited access to fields, hunting areas, or other natural resources in the Nation Ford area, maybe? So that seems to be a possibility based on the archaeology anyway. So after that barrage of information, what I want you to take away from this talk is that the Charraw are truly resilient and resourceful people. We're able to trace their flight from the Dan River to the PD and then to the Catawba. Like other refugees, they affected the history of each of these places, leaving their own lasting imprint on local history and genealogy. The archaeological site of Charraw town in the 1750s, Catawba Nation, is just one piece of this larger story. The fragments of everyday life found there remind us how complicated things were for Indigenous people as they made difficult choices in the face of colonial violence and uncertainty, and that words like coalescence can disguise the very real practices that accompanied the choice to move a fire to a new place and start again. Brooke Bauer has highlighted how Catawba women were the power brokers for arranging the distribution of resources in the Catawba Nation, as well as forging family alliances. Archaeology provides hints at how they may have done so. I'd like to thank the Research Labs of Archaeology, the Center for the Study of the American South, my present employer, North Carolina Office of State Archaeology, as well as all of the smiling faces in this field school photo, and all of the individuals who helped with this project behind the scenes. Thanks for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.